Chapter 11 of the Red Thumb Mark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. The Red Thumb Mark by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 11. The Ambush. "I'm going to ask for your collaboration in another case," said Thorndyke, a day or two later. "It appears to be one of suicide, but the solicitors to the Griffin office have asked me to go down to the place, which is in the neighbourhood of Barnet, and be present at the post mortem and the inquest. They have managed to arrange that the inquest shall take place directly after the post mortem, so that we shall be able to do the whole business in a single visit." "Is the case one of any intricacy?" I asked. "I don't think so," he answered. "It looks like a common suicide. But you can never tell. The importance of the case at present arises entirely from the heavy insurance. A verdict of suicide will mean a gain of £10,000 to the Griffin, so, naturally, the directors are anxious to get the case settled and not inclined to boggle over a little expense." "Naturally. And when will the expedition take place?" I asked. "The inquest is fixed for tomorrow. What is the matter? Does that fall foul of any arrangement of yours?" "Oh, nothing of importance," I replied hastily, deeply ashamed of the momentary change of countenance that my friend had been so quick to observe. "Well, what is it?" persisted Thorndyke. "You have got something on." "It's nothing, I tell you, but what can be easily arranged to suit your plans." "Cherchez-la, queried Thorndyke, with an exasperating grin. "Yes," I answered, turning as red as a pickled cabbage. "Since you are so beastly inquisitive, Miss Gibson wrote, on behalf of Mrs. Hornby, asking me to dine with them en famille tomorrow evening, and I sent off an acceptance an hour ago." "And you call that nothing of importance!" exclaimed Thorndyke. "Alas! And likewise alackaday, which is an approximately synonymous expression. The age of chivalry is past, indeed. Of course you must keep your appointment. I can manage quite well alone." "We shouldn't be back early enough for me to go to Kensington from the station, I suppose?" "No, certainly not. I find that the trains are very awkward. We should not reach King's Cross until nearly 1 in the morning." "Then, in that case, I shall write to Miss Gibson and excuse myself." "Oh, I wouldn't do that," said Thorndyke. "It will disappoint them, and really it is not necessary." "I shall write forthwith," I said firmly, "so please don't try to dissuade me. I have been feeling quite uncomfortable at the thought that, all the time I have been in your employ, I seem to have done nothing but idle about and amuse myself. The opportunity of doing something tangible for my wages is too precious to be allowed to slip." Thorndyke chuckled indulgently. "You shall do as you please, my dear boy," he said. "But don't imagine that you have been eating the bread of idleness. When you see this Hornby case worked out in detail, you will be surprised to find how large a part you have taken in unravelling it. Your worth to me has been far beyond your poor little salary, I can assure you." "It is very handsome of you to say that," I said, highly gratified to learn that I really was of use and not, as I had begun to suspect, a mere object of charity. "It is perfectly true," he answered. "And now, since you are going to help me in this case, I will set you your task. The case, as I have said, appears to be quite simple, but it never does to take the simplicity for granted. Here is the letter from the solicitors giving the facts as far as they are known at present. On the shelves there you will find Casper, Taylor, Guy and Ferrier and the other authorities on medical jurisprudence, and I will put out 1 or 2 other books that you may find useful. I want you to extract and make classified notes of everything that may bear on such a case as the present one may turn out to be. We must go prepared to meet any contingency that may arise. This is my invariable practice, and even if the case turns out to be quite simple, the labour is never wasted, for it represents so much experience gained." "Casper and Taylor are pretty old, aren't they?" I objected. "So is suicide," he retorted dryly. "It is a capital mistake to neglect the old authorities. There were strong men before Agamemnon, and some of them were uncommonly strong, let me tell you. Give your best attention to the venerable Casper and the obsolete Taylor, and you will not be without your reward." As a result of these injunctions, I devoted the remainder of the day to the consideration of the various methods by which a man might contrive to effect his exit from the stage of human activities; and a very engrossing study I found it, and the more interesting in view of the problem that awaited solution on the morrow, but yet not so engrossing but that I was able to find time to write a long, rather intimate and minutely explanatory letter to Miss Gibson, in which I even mentioned the hour of our return as showing the impossibility of my keeping my engagement. Not that I had the smallest fear of her taking offence, for it is an evidence of my respect and regard for her that I cancelled the appointment without a momentary doubt that she would approve of my action. But it was pleasant to write to her at length, and to feel the intimacy of keeping her informed of the details of my life. The case, when we went to inquire into it on the spot, turned out to be a suicide of the most transparent type, whereat both Thorndyke and I were, I think, a little disappointed, he at having apparently done so little for a very substantial fee, and I at having no opportunity for applying my recently augmented knowledge. "Yes," said my colleague, as we rolled ourselves up in our rugs in adjacent corners of the railway carriage, "it has been a flat affair, and the whole thing could have been managed by the local solicitor. But it is not a waste of time after all, for, you see, I have to do many a day's work for which I get not a farthing of payment, nor even any recognition, so that I do not complain if I occasionally find myself receiving more payment than my actual services merit. And as to you, I take it that you have acquired a good deal of valuable knowledge on the subject of suicide, and knowledge, as the late Lord Bacon remarked with more truth than originality, is power." To this I made no reply, having just lit my pipe and feeling uncommonly drowsy, and my companion having followed my example, we smoked in silence, becoming more and more somnolent, until the train drew up in the terminus and we turned out, yawning and shivering, on to the platform. "Bah!" exclaimed Thorndyke, drawing his rug round his shoulders. "This is a cheerless hour. 1:15. See how chilly and miserable all these poor devils of passengers look. Shall we cab it or walk?" "I think a sharp walk would rouse our circulation after sitting huddled up in the carriage for so long," I answered. "So do I," said Thorndyke. "So let us away. Hark forward, and also tally ho. In fact, one might go so far as to say Yoicks. That gentleman appears to favour the strenuous life, if one may judge by the size of his sprocket wheel." He pointed to a bicycle that was drawn up by the curb in the approach, a machine of the road racer type, with an enormous sprocket wheel, indicating a gear of, at least, 90. "Some scorcher of an amateur racer, probably," I said, "who takes the opportunity of getting a spin on the wood pavement when the streets are empty." I looked round to see if I could identify the owner, but the machine appeared to be, for the moment, taking care of itself. King's Cross is one of those districts in which the inhabitants are slow in settling down for the night, and even at 1:15 in the morning its streets are not entirely deserted. Here and there the glimmer of a street lamp, or the far-reaching ray from a tall electric light, reveals the form of some nocturnal prowler creeping along with cat-like stealthiness, or bursting, cat-like, into unmelodious song. Not greatly desirous of the society of these roisterers, we crossed quickly from the station into the Gray's Inn Road, now silent and excessively dismal in aspect, and took our way along the western side. We had turned the curve and were crossing Manchester Street, when a series of yelps from ahead announced the presence of a party of merrymakers, whom we were not yet able to see, however, for the night was an exceptionally dark one. But the sounds of revelry continued to increase in volume as we proceeded, until, as we passed Sidmouth Street, we came in sight of the revellers. There were some half-dozen in number, all of them roughs of the hooligan type, and they were evidently in boisterous spirits, for, as they passed the entrance to the Royal Free Hospital, they halted and battered furiously at the gate. Shortly after this exploit, they crossed the road on to our side, whereupon Thorndyke caught my arm and slackened his pace. "Let them draw ahead," said he. "It is a wise precaution to give all hooligan gangs a very wide berth at this time of night. We had better turn down Heathcote Street and cross Mecklenburgh Square." We continued to walk on at reduced speed until we reached Heathcote Street, into which we turned and so entered Mecklenburgh Square, where we mended our pace once more. "The hooligan," pursued Thorndyke, as we walked briskly across the silent square, "covers a multitude of sins, ranging from highway robbery with violence and paid assassination, technically known as bashing, down to the criminal folly of philanthropic magistrate, who seems to think that his function in the economy of nature is to secure the survival of the unfittest. There goes a cyclist along Guildford Street. I wonder if that is our strenuous friend from the station. If so, he has slipped past the hooligans." We were just entering Doughty Street, and, as Thorndyke spoke, a man on a bicycle was visible for an instant at the crossing of the two streets. When we reached Guildford Street, we both looked down the long, lamp-lighted vista, but the cyclist had vanished. "We had better go straight on into Theobald's Road," said Thorndyke, and we accordingly pursued our way up the fine old-world street, from whose tall houses our footfalls echoed, so that we seemed to be accompanied by an invisible multitude, until we reached that part where it unaccountably changes its name and becomes John Street. "There always seems to me something very pathetic about these old Bloomsbury streets," said Thorndyke, "with their faded grandeur and dignified seediness. They remind me of some prim and aged gentlewoman in reduced circumstances, who Hallo! What was that?" A faint, sharp thud from behind had been followed instantly by the shattering of a ground-floor window in front. We both stopped dead and remained, for a couple of seconds, staring into the gloom from whence the first sound had come. Then Thorndyke darted diagonally across the road at a swift run, and I immediately followed. At the moment when the affair happened we had gone about 40 yards up John Street, that is, from the place where it is crossed by Henry Street, and we now raced across the road to the further corner of the latter street. When we reached it, however, the little thoroughfare was empty, and, as we paused for a moment, no sound of retreating footsteps broke the silence. "The shot certainly came from here," said Thorndyke. "Come on," and again he broke into a run. A few yards up the street, a mews turns off to the left, and into this my companion plunged, motioning me to go straight on, which I accordingly did, and in a few paces reached the top of the street. Here a narrow thoroughfare, with a broad, smooth pavement, bears off to the left, parallel with the mews, and, as I arrived at the corner and glanced up the little street, I saw a man on a bicycle, gliding swiftly and silently toward Little James Street. With a mighty shout of "Stop, thief!" I started in hot pursuit, but, though the man's feet were moving in an apparently leisurely manner, he drew ahead at an astonishing pace, in spite of my efforts to overtake him. And then it dawned upon me that the slow revolutions of his feet were due, in reality, to the unusually high gear of the machine that he was riding. As I realized this, and at the same moment recalled the bicycle that we had seen in the station, the fugitive swung round into Little James Street and vanished. The speed at which the man was travelling made further pursuit utterly futile, so I turned and walked back, panting and perspiring from the unwonted exertion. As I re-entered Henry Street, Thorndyke emerged from the mews and halted on seeing me. "Cyclist?" he asked laconically as I came up. "Yes," I answered, "riding a machine geared up to about 90. "Ah! He must have followed us from the station," said Thorndyke. "Did you notice if he was carrying anything?" "He had a walking stick in his hand. I didn't see anything else." "What sort of walking stick?" "I couldn't see very distinctly. It was a stoutish stick. I should say a malacca, probably. And it had what looked like a horn handle. I could see that as he passed a street lamp." "What kind of lamp had he?" "I couldn't see. But as he turned the corner I noticed that it seemed to burn very dimly." "A little Vaseline, or even oil, smeared on the outside of the glass will reduce the glare of a lamp very appreciably," my companion remarked, "especially on a dusty road. Ha! Here is the proprietor of the broken window. He wants to know, you know." We had once more turned into John Street, and now perceived a man standing on the wide doorstep of the house with the shuttered window, looking anxiously up and down the street. "Do either of you two gents know anything about this here?" he asked, pointing to the broken pane. "Yes," said Thorndyke. "We happened to be passing when it was done. In fact," he added, "I rather suspect that the missile, whatever it was intended for our benefit." "Oh!" said the man. "Who done it?" "That I can't say," replied Thorndyke. "Whoever he was, he made off on a bicycle, and we were unable to catch him." "Oh!" said the man, once more, regarding us with growing suspicion. "On a bicycle, hey? Damn funny, ain't it? What did he do with it?" "That is what I should like to find out," said Thorndyke. "I see this house is empty." "Yes, it's empty. Leastways, it's to let. I'm the caretaker. But what's that got to do with it?" "Merely this," answered Thorndyke, "that the object, Stone, bullet, or whatever it may have been, was aimed, I believe, at me, and I should like to ascertain its nature. Would you do me the favour of permitting me to look for it?" The caretaker was evidently inclined to refuse this request, for he glanced suspiciously from my companion to me once or twice before replying, but, at length, he turned towards the open door and gruffly invited us to enter. A paraffin lamp was on the floor in a recess of the hall, and this our conductor took up when he had closed the street door. "This is the room," he said, turning the key and thrusting the door open. "The library, they call it, but it's the front parlour in plain English." He entered and, holding the lamp above his head, stared balefully at the broken window. Thorndyke glanced quickly along the floor in the direction that the missile would have taken, and then said, "Do you see any mark on the wall there?" As he spoke, he indicated the wall opposite the window, which obviously could not have been struck by a projectile entering with such extreme obliquity, and I was about to point out this fact when I fortunately remembered the great virtue of silence. Our friend approached the wall, still holding up the lamp, and scrutinized the surface with close attention. And while he was thus engaged, I observed Thorndyke stoop quickly and pick up something, which he deposited carefully and without remark in his waistcoat pocket. "I don't see no bruise anywhere," said the caretaker, sweeping his hand over the wall. "Perhaps the thing struck this wall," suggested Thorndyke, pointing to the one that was actually in the line of fire. "Yes, of course," he added. "It would be this one. The shot came from Henry Street." The caretaker crossed the room and threw the light of the lamp on the wall thus indicated. "Ah, here we are!" he exclaimed, with gloomy satisfaction, pointing to a small dent in which the wall paper was turned back and the plaster exposed. "Looks almost like a bullet mark, but you say you didn't hear no report." "No," said Thorndyke, "there was no report. It must have been a catapult." The caretaker set the lamp down on the floor and proceeded to grope about for the projectile, in which operation we both assisted, and I could not suppress a faint smile as I noticed the earnestness with which Thorndyke peered about the floor in search of the missile that was quietly reposing in his waistcoat pocket. We were deep in our investigations when there was heard an uncompromising double knock at the street door, followed by the loud pealing of a bell in the basement. "Bobby, I suppose," growled the caretaker. "Here's a bloomin' fuss about nothin'." He caught up the lamp and went out, leaving us in the dark. "I picked it up, you know," said Thorndyke, when we were alone. "I saw you," I answered. "Good. I applaud your discretion," he rejoined. The caretaker's supposition was correct. When he returned he was accompanied by a burly constable, who saluted us with a cheerful smile and glanced facetiously round the empty room. "Our boys," said he, nodding towards the broken window. "They're playful lads, that they are. You were passing when it happened, sir, I hear?" "Yes," answered Thorndyke, and he gave the constable a brief account of the occurrence, which the latter listened to, notebook in hand. "Well," said he, when the narrative concluded, "if those hooligan boys are going to take to catapults, they'll make things lively all around." "You ought to run some of 'em in," said the caretaker. "Run 'em in!" exclaimed the constable, in a tone of disgust. "Yes, and then the magistrate will tell 'em to be good boys and give 'em 5 shillings out of the poor box to buy illustrated testaments. I'd testament them, worthless varmints." He rammed his notebook fiercely into his pocket and stalked out of the room into the street, whither we followed. "You'll find that bullet, or stone, when you sweep up the room," he said, as he turned on to his beat, "and you better let us have it. Good night, sir." He strolled off toward Henry Street, while Thorndyke and I resumed our journey southward. "Why were you so secret about that projectile?" I asked my friend as we walked up the street. "Partly to avoid discussion with the caretaker," he replied, "but principally because I thought it likely that a constable would pass the house and, seeing the light, come in to make inquiries." "And then?" "Then I should have to hand the object over to him." "And why not? Is the object a specially interesting one?" "It is highly interesting to me at the present moment," replied Thorndyke with a chuckle, "because I have not examined it. I have a theory as to its nature, which theory I should like to test before taking the police into my confidence." "Are you going to take me into your confidence?" I asked. "When we get home, if you are not too sleepy," he replied. On our arrival at his chambers, Thorndyke desired me to light up and clear one end of the table while he went to the workshop to fetch some tools. I turned back the table cover and, having adjusted the gas so as to light this part of the table, waited in some impatience for my colleague's return. In a few minutes he re-entered bearing a small vice, a metal saw, and a wide-mouthed bottle. "What have you got in that bottle?" I asked, perceiving a metal object inside it. "That is the projectile, which I have thought fit to rinse in distilled water for reasons that will presently appear." He agitated the bottle gently for a minute or so, and then, with a pair of dissecting forceps, lifted out the object and held it above the surface of the water to drain, after which he laid it carefully on a piece of blotting paper. I stooped over the projectile and examined it with great curiosity, while Thorndyke stood by regarding me with an almost equal interest. "Well," he said, after watching me in silence for some time, "what do you see?" "I see a small brass cylinder," I answered, "about 2 inches long and rather thicker than an ordinary lead pencil. One end is conical and there is a small hole at the apex which seems to contain a steel point. The other end is flat, but has in the centre a small square projection, such as might fit a watch key. I notice also a small hole in the side of the cylinder close to the flat end. The thing looks like a miniature shell and appears to be hollow." "It is hollow," said Thorndyke. "You must have observed that, when I held it up to drain, the water trickling out through the hole at the pointed end." "Yes, I noticed that." "Now take it up and shake it." I did so and felt some heavy object rattle inside it. "There is some looser body inside it," I said, "which fits it pretty closely as it moves only in the long diameter." "Quite so. Your description is excellent. And now, what is the nature of this projectile?" "I should say it is a miniature shell, or explosive bullet." "Wrong!" said Thorndyke. "A very natural inference, but a wrong one." "Then what is the thing?" I demanded, my curiosity still further aroused. "I will show you," he replied. "It is something much more subtle than an explosive bullet, which would really be a rather crude appliance, admirably thought out and thoroughly well executed. We have to deal with a most ingenious and capable man." I was fain to laugh at his enthusiastic appreciation of the methods of his would-be assassin, and the humour of the situation then appeared to dawn on him, for he said, with an apologetic smile, "I am not expressing approval, you must understand, but merely professional admiration. It is this class of criminal that creates the necessity for my services. He is my patron, so to speak, my ultimate employer; for the common crook can be dealt with quite efficiently by the common policeman." While he was speaking he had been fitting the little cylinder between 2 pads of tissue paper in the vise, which he now screwed up tight. Then, with the fine metal saw, he began to cut the projectile, lengthwise, into 2 slightly unequal parts. This operation took some time, especially since he was careful not to cut the loose body inside; but at length the section was completed and the interior of the cylinder exposed, when he released it from the vise and held it up before me with an expression of triumph. "Now, what do you make of it?" he demanded. I took the object in my fingers and looked at it closely, but was at first more puzzled than before. The loose body I now saw to be a cylinder of lead, about half an inch long, accurately fitting the inside of the cylinder but capable of sliding freely backwards and forwards. The steel point which I had noticed in the hole at the apex of the conical end was now seen to be the pointed termination of a slender steel rod, which projected fully an inch into the cavity of the cylinder, and the conical end itself was a solid mass of lead. "Well?" queried Thorndyke, seeing that I was silent. "You tell me it is not an explosive bullet," I replied. "Otherwise I should have been confirmed in that opinion. I should have said that the percussion cap was carried by this lead plunger and struck on the end of that steel rod when the flight of the bullet was suddenly arrested." "Very good indeed," said Thorndyke. "You are right so far as this is, in fact, the mechanism of a percussion shell. But look at this. You see this little rod was driven inside the bullet when the latter struck the wall. Let us replace it in its original position." He laid the end of a small flat file against the end of the rod and pressed it firmly, when the rod slid through the hole until it projected an inch beyond the apex of the cone. Then he handed the projectile back to me. A single glance at the point of the steel rod made the whole thing clear, and I gave a whistle of consternation. For the rod was a fine tube with a sharply pointed end. "The infernal scoundrel!" I exclaimed. "It is a hypodermic needle." "Yes, a veterinary hypodermic, of extra large bore. Now you see the subtlety and ingenuity of the whole thing. If he had had a reasonable chance, he would certainly have succeeded." "You speak quite regretfully," I said, laughing at the oddity of his attitude towards the assassin. "Not at all," he replied. "I have the character of a single handed player, but even the most self reliant man can hardly make a post mortem on himself. I am merely appreciating an admirable piece of mechanical design most efficiently carried out. Observe the completeness of the thing, and the way in which all the necessities of the case are foreseen and met. This projectile was discharged from a powerful air gun, the walking stick form, provided with a force pump and key. The barrel of that gun was rifled." "How do you know that?" I asked. "Well, to begin with, it would be useless to fit a needle to the projectile unless the latter was made to travel with the point forwards. But there is direct evidence that the barrel was rifled. You notice the little square projection on the back surface of the cylinder. That was evidently made to fit a washer or wad, probably a thin plate of soft metal, which would be driven by the pressure from behind into the grooves of the rifling, and thus give a spinning motion to the bullet. When the latter left the barrel, the wad would drop off, leaving it free." "I see. I was wondering what the square projection was for. It is, as you say, extremely ingenious." "Highly ingenious," said Thorndyke enthusiastically. "And so is the whole device. See how perfectly it would have worked but for a mere fluke and for the complication of your presence. Supposing that I had been alone, so that he could have approached to a shorter distance. In that case he would not have missed, and the thing would have been done. You see how it was intended to be done, I suppose?" "I think so," I answered. "But I should like to hear your account of the process." "Well, you see, he first finds out that I am returning by a late train, which he seems to have done, and he waits for me at the terminus. Meanwhile he fills the cylinder with a solution of a powerful alkaloidal poison, which is easily done by dipping the needle into the liquid and sucking at the small hole near the back end, when the piston will be drawn up and the liquid will follow it. You notice that the upper side of the piston is covered with Vaseline, introduced through the hole, no doubt, which would prevent the poison from coming out into the mouth and make the cylinder secure from leakage. On my arrival, he follows me on his bicycle until I pass through a sufficiently secluded neighbourhood. Then he approaches me, or passes me, and waits round a corner, and shoots at pretty close range. It doesn't matter where he hits me, all parts are equally vital, so he can aim at the middle of my back. Then the bullet comes spinning through the air point foremost. The needle passes through the clothing and enters the flesh, and, as the bullet is suddenly stopped, the heavy piston flies down by its own great momentum and squirts out a jet of the poison into the tissues. The bullet then disengages itself and drops on to the ground. Meanwhile, our friend has mounted his bicycle and is off, and when I feel the prick of the needle, I turn, and, without stopping to look for the bullet, immediately give chase. I am, of course, not able to overtake a man on a racing machine, but still I follow him some distance. Then the poison begins to take effect, the more rapidly from the violent exercise, and presently I drop insensible. Later on my body is found. There are no marks of violence, and possibly the needle puncture escapes observation at the post mortem, in which case the verdict will be death from heart failure. Even if the poison and the puncture are discovered, there is no clue. The bullet lies some streets away and is probably picked up by some boy or passing stranger, who cannot conjecture its use and who would never connect it with the man who was found dead. You will admit that the whole plan has been worked out with surprising completeness and foresight." "Yes," I answered. "There is no doubt that the fellow is a most infernally clever scoundrel. May I ask if you have any idea who he is?" "Well," Thorndyke replied, "seeing that, as Carlyle has unkindly pointed out, clever people are not in an overwhelming majority, and that, of the clever people whom I know, only a very few are interested in my immediate demise, I am able to form a fairly probable conjecture." "And what do you mean to do?" "For the present I shall maintain an attitude of masterly inactivity and avoid the night air." "But surely," I exclaimed, "you will take some measures to protect yourself against attempts of this kind. You can hardly doubt now that your accident in the fog was really an attempted murder." "I never did doubt it, as a matter of fact, although I prevaricated at the time. But I have not enough evidence against this man at present, and, consequently, can do nothing but show that I suspect him, which would be foolish. Whereas, if I lie low, one of two things will happen. Either the occasion for my removal, which is only a temporary one, will pass, or he will commit himself, and will put a definite clue into my hands. Then we shall find the air cane, the bicycle, perhaps a little stock of poison, and certain other trifles that I have in mind, which will be good confirmatory evidence, though insufficient in themselves. And now I think I really must adjourn this meeting, or we shall be good for nothing tomorrow. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Red Thumb Mark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. The Red Thumb Mark by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 12. It Might Have Been. It was now only a week from the date on which the trial was to open. In 8 days the mystery would almost certainly be solved, if it was capable of solution, for the trial promised to be quite a short one, and then Reuben Hornby would either be a convicted felon or a free man, clear of the stigma of the crime. For several days past, Thorndyke had been in almost constant possession of the laboratory, while his own small room, devoted ordinarily to bacteriology and microscopical work, was kept continually locked, a state of things that reduced Polton to a condition of the most extreme nervous irritation, especially when, as he told me indignantly, he met Mr. Anstey emerging from the Holy of Holies, grinning and rubbing his hands, and giving utterance to genial but unparliamentary expressions of amused satisfaction. I had met Anstey on several occasions lately, and each time liked him better than the last, for his whimsical, facetious manner covered a nature, as it often does, that was serious and thoughtful, and I found him not only a man of considerable learning, but one also of a lofty standard of conduct. His admiration for Thorndyke was unbounded, and I could see that the two men collaborated with the utmost sympathy and mutual satisfaction. But although I regarded Mr. Anstey with feelings of the liveliest friendship, I was far from gratified when, on the morning of which I am writing, I observed him from our sitting-room window crossing the gravelled space from Crown Office Row and evidently bearing down on our chambers. For the fact is that I was awaiting the arrival of Juliet, and should greatly have preferred to be alone at the moment, seeing that Thorndyke had already gone out. It is true that my fair enslaver was not due for nearly half an hour, but then, who could say how long Anstey would stay, or what embarrassments might arise from my efforts to escape? By all of which, it may be perceived that my disease had reached a very advanced stage, and that I was unequal to those tactics of concealment that are commonly attributed to the ostrich. A sharp rap of the knocker announced the arrival of the disturber of my peace, and when I opened the door Anstey walked in with the air of a man to whom an hour more or less is of no consequence whatsoever. He shook my hand with mock solemnity, and, seating himself upon the edge of the table, proceeded to roll a cigarette with exasperating deliberation. "I infer," said he, "that our learned brother is practising parlour magic upstairs, or peradventure he has gone on a journey?" "He has a consultation this morning," I answered. "Was he expecting you?" "Evidently not, or he would have been here. No, I just looked in to ask a question about the case of your friend Hornby. You know it comes on for trial next week." "Yes, Thorndyke told me. What do you think of Hornby's prospects? Is he going to be convicted, or will he get an acquittal?" "He will be entirely passive," replied Anstey. "But we," here he slapped his chest impressively, "are going to secure an acquittal. You will be highly entertained, my learned friend, and Mr. the Enemy will be excessively surprised." He inspected the newly made cigarette with a critical air and chuckled softly. "You seem pretty confident," I remarked. "I am," he answered, "though Thorndyke considers failure possible, which, of course, it is if the jury box should chance to be filled with microcephalic idiots, and the judge should prove incapable of understanding simple technical evidence. But we hope that neither of these things will happen, and if they do not, we feel pretty safe. By the way, I hope I am not divulging your principal's secrets?" "Well," I replied with a smile, "you have been more explicit than Thorndyke ever has." "Have I?" he exclaimed with mock anxiety. "Then I must swear you to secrecy. Thorndyke is so very close, and he is quite right, too. I never cease admiring his tactics of allowing the enemy to fortify and barricade the entrance that he does not mean to attack. But I see you are wishing me at the devil, so give me a cigar and I will go, though not to that particular destination." "Will you have one of Thorndyke's special brand?" I asked malignantly. "What? Those foul Trichinopolies? Not while brown paper is to be obtained at every stationer's. I'd sooner smoke my own wig." I tendered my own case, from which he selected a cigar with anxious care and much sniffing. Then he bade me a ceremonious adieu and departed down the stairs, blithely humming a melody from the latest comic opera. He had not left more than 5 minutes when a soft and elaborate rat-tat from the little brass knocker brought my heart into my mouth. I ran to the door and flung it open, revealing Juliet standing on the threshold. "May I come in?" she asked. "I want to have a few words with you before we start." I looked at her with some anxiety, for she was manifestly agitated, and the hand that she held out to me trembled. "I am greatly upset, Dr. Jervis," she said, ignoring the chair that I had placed for her. "Mr. Lawley has been giving us his views of poor Reuben's case, and his attitude fills me with dismay." "Hang Mr. Lawley!" I muttered, and then apologized hastily. "What made you go to him, Miss Gibson?" "I didn't go to him. He came to us. He dined with us last night, he and Walter, and his manner was gloomy in the extreme. After dinner Walter took him apart with me and asked him what he really thought of the case. He was most pessimistic. 'My dear sir,' he said, 'the only advice I can give you is that you prepare yourself to contemplate disaster as philosophically as you can. In my opinion your cousin is almost certainly to be convicted.' 'But,' said Walter, 'what about his defence? I understood that there was at least a plausible case.' Mr. Lawley shrugged his shoulders. 'I have a sort of alibi that will go for nothing, but I have no evidence to offer in answer to that of the prosecution, and no case. And I may say, speaking in confidence, that I do not believe there is any case. I do not see how there can be any case, and I have heard nothing from Dr. Thorndyke to lead me to suppose that he has really done anything in the matter. Is this true, Dr. Jervis? Oh, do tell me the real truth about it. I have been so miserable and terrified since I heard this, and I was so full of hope before. Tell me, is it true? Will Reuben be sent to prison after all?" In her agitation she laid her hands upon my arm and looked up into my face with her grey eyes swimming with tears, and was so piteous, so trustful, and, withal, so bewitching that my reserve melted like snow before a July sun. "It is not true," I answered, taking her hands in mine and speaking perforce in a low tone that I might not betray my emotion. "If it were, it would mean that I have wilfully deceived you, that I have been false to our friendship, and how much that friendship has been to me no one but myself will ever know." She crept a little closer to me with a manner at once penitent and wheedling. "You are not going to be angry with me, are you? It was foolish of me to listen to Mr. Lawley after all you have told me, and it did look like a want of trust in you, I know. But you, who are so strong and wise, must make allowance for a woman who is neither. It is all so terrible that I am quite unstrung. But say you are not really displeased with me, for that would hurt me most of all." Oh, Delilah! That concluding stroke of the shears severed the very last lock, and left me, morally speaking, as bald as a billiard ball. Henceforth I was at her mercy and would have divulged without a scruple the uttermost secrets of my principal, but that astute gentleman had placed me beyond the reach of temptation. "As to being angry with you," I answered, "I am not, like Thorndyke, one to essay the impossible, and if I could be angry it would hurt me more than it would you. But, in fact, you are not to blame at all, and I am an egotistical brute. Of course you were alarmed and distressed. Nothing could be more natural. So now let me try to chase away your fears and restore your confidence. I have told you what Thorndyke said to Reuben, that he has good hopes of making his innocence clear to everybody. That alone should have been enough." "I know it should," murmured Juliet remorsefully. "Please forgive me for my want of faith." "But," I continued, "I can quote you the words of one to whose opinions you will attach more weight. Mr. Anstey was here less than a half hour ago." "Do you mean Reuben's counsel?" "Yes." "And what did he say? Oh, do tell me what he said." "He said, in brief, that he was quite confident of obtaining an acquittal, and that the prosecution would receive a great surprise. He seemed highly pleased with his brief, and spoke with great admiration of Thorndyke. "Did he really say that? That he was confident of an acquittal?" Her voice was breathless and unsteady, and she was clearly, as she had said, quite unstrung. "What a relief it is!" she murmured incoherently. "And so very, very kind of you." She wiped her eyes and laughed a queer, shaky little laugh. Then, quite suddenly, she burst into a passion of sobbing. Hardly conscious of what I did, I drew her gently towards me and rested her head on my shoulder, whilst I whispered into her ear I know not what words of consolation, but I am sure that I called her "dear Juliet," and probably used other expressions equally improper and reprehensible. Presently she recovered herself, and, having dried her eyes, regarded me somewhat shamefacedly, blushing hotly, but smiling very sweetly nevertheless. "I am ashamed of myself," she said, "coming here and weeping on your bosom like a great baby. It is to be hoped that your other clients do not behave in this way." Whereat we both laughed heartily, and, our emotional equilibrium being thus restored, we began to think of the object of our meeting. "I am afraid I have wasted a great deal of time," said Juliet, looking at her watch. "Shall we be too late, do you think?" "I hope not," I replied, "for Reuben will be looking for us. But we must hurry." I caught up my hat, and we went forth, closing the oak behind us, and took our way up King's Bench Walk in silence, but with a new and delightful sense of intimate comradeship. I glanced from time to time at my companion, and noted that her cheek still bore a rosy flush, and when she looked at me there was a sparkle in her eye, and a smiling softness in her glance, that stirred my heart until I trembled with the intensity of the passion that I must needs conceal. And even while I was feeling that I must tell her all, and have done with it, tell her that I was her abject slave, and she my goddess, my queen, that in the face of such a love as mine no man could have any claim upon her, even then, there rose the still, small voice that began to call me an unfaithful steward, and to remind me of a duty and trust that were sacred even beyond love. In Fleet Street I hailed a cab, and, as I took my seat beside my fair companion, the voice began to wax and speak in bolder and sterner accents. "Christopher Jervis," it said, "what is this that you are doing? Are you a man of honour, or naught but a mean, pitiful blackguard? You, the trusted agent of this poor, misused gentleman, are you not planning in your black heart how you shall rob him of that which, if he is a man at all, must be more to him than his liberty or even his honour? Shame on you for a miserable weakling! Have done with these philanderings, and keep your covenants like a gentleman, or, at least, an honest man." At this point in my meditations, Juliet turned toward me with a coaxing smile. "My legal adviser seems to be revolving some deep and weighty matter," she said. I pulled myself together and looked at her sparkling eyes and rosy, dimpling cheeks, so winsome and lovely and lovable. Come, I thought, I must put an end to this at once or I am lost. But it cost me a very agony of effort to do it, which agony, I trust, may be duly set to my account by those who may sit in judgment on me. "Your legal adviser, Miss Gibson," I said, and at that Miss Gibson I thought she looked at me a little queerly, "has been reflecting that he has acted considerably beyond his jurisdiction." "In what respect?" she asked. "In passing on to you information which was given to him in very strict confidence, and, in fact, with an implied promise of secrecy on his part." "But the information was not of a very secret character, was it?" "More so than it appeared. You see, Thorndyke thinks it so important not to let the prosecution suspect that he has anything up his sleeve that he has kept even Mr. Lawley in the dark, and has never said as much to me as Anstey did this morning." "And now you are sorry you told me. You think I have led you into a breach of trust. Is it not so?" She spoke without a trace of petulance, and her tone of dignified self-accusation made me a veritable worm. "My dear Miss Gibson," I expostulated, "you entirely misunderstand me. I am not in the least sorry that I told you. How could I have done otherwise under the circumstances? But I want you to understand that I have taken the responsibility of communicating to you what is really a professional secret, and that you are to consider it as such." "That is how I understood it," replied Juliet, "and you may rely upon me not to utter a syllable on the subject to anyone." I thanked her for this promise, and then, by way of making conversation, gave her an account in detail of Anstey's visit, not even omitting the incident of the cigar. "And are Dr. Thorndyke's cigars so extraordinarily bad?" she asked. "Not at all," I replied. "Only they are not to every man's taste. The trichinopoly cheroot is Thorndyke's one dissipation, and, I must say, he takes it very temperately. Under ordinary circumstances he smokes a pipe, but after a specially heavy day's work, or on any occasion of festivity or rejoicing, he indulges in a trichinopoly, and he smokes the very best that can be got." "So even the greatest men have their weaknesses," Juliet moralized. "But I wish I had known Dr. Thorndyke's sooner, for Mr. Hornby had a large box of trichinopoly cheroots given to him, and I believe they were exceptionally fine ones. However, he tried one and didn't like it, so he transferred the whole consignment to Walter, who smokes all sorts and conditions of cigars." So we talked on, from one commonplace to another, and each more conventional than the last. In my nervousness I overdid my part, and having broken the ice, proceeded to smash it to impalpable fragments. Endeavouring merely to be unemotional, and to avoid undue intimacy of manner, I swung to the opposite extreme, and became almost stiff, and perhaps the more so since I was writhing with the agony of repression. Meanwhile a corresponding change took place in my companion. At first her manner seemed doubtful and bewildered. Then she, too, grew more distant and polite, and less disposed for conversation. Perhaps her conscience began to rebuke her, or it may be that my coolness suggested to her that her conduct had been not quite of the kind that would have commended itself to Reuben. But however that may have been, we continued to draw farther and farther apart, and in that short half hour we retraced the steps of our growing friendship to such purpose that, when we descended from the cab at the prison gate, we seemed more like strangers than on the first day that we met. It was a miserable ending to all our delightful comradeship, and yet what other end could one expect in this world of cross purposes and things that might have been? In the extremity of my wretchedness, I could have wept on the bosom of the portly warder who opened the wicket, even as Juliet had wept upon mine; and it was almost a relief to me, when our brief visit was over, to find that we should not return together to King's Cross, as was our wont, but that Juliet would go back by omnibus that she might do some shopping in Oxford Street, leaving me to walk home alone. I saw her to the omnibus, and stood on the pavement looking wistfully at the lumbering vehicle as it dwindled in the distance. At last, with a sigh of deepest despondency, I turned my face homeward, and, walking like one in a dream, retraced the route over which I had journeyed so often of late, and with such different sensations. Chapter 12.
Of the Red Thumb Mark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Kilmer. The Red Thumb Mark by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 13. Murder by Post. The next few days were perhaps the most unhappy that I have known. My life, indeed, since I had left the hospital, had been one of many disappointments and much privation. Unfulfilled desires and ambitions unrealized had combined with distaste for the daily drudgery that had fallen to my lot to embitter my poverty and cause me to look with gloomy distrust upon the unpromising future. But no sorrow that I had hitherto experienced could compare with the grief that I now felt in contemplating the irretrievable ruin of what I knew to be the greatest passion of my life. For to a man like myself, of few friends and deep affections, one great emotional upheaval exhausts the possibility of nature, leaving only the capacity for feeble and ineffective echoes. The edifice of love that is raised upon the ruins of a great passion can compare with the original no more than can the paltry mosque that perches upon the mound of Jonah with the glories of the palace that lies entombed beneath. I had made a pretext to write to Juliet, and had received a reply quite frank and friendly in tone, by which I knew that she had not, as some women would have done, set the blame upon me for our temporary outburst of emotion. And yet, There was a subtle difference from her previous manner of writing that only emphasized the finality of our separation. I think Thorndyke perceived that something had gone awry, though I was at great pains to maintain a cheerful exterior and keep myself occupied, and he probably formed a pretty shrewd guess at the nature of the trouble, but he said nothing, and I only judged that he had observed some change in my manner by the fact that there was blended with his usual quiet geniality an almost insensible note of sympathy and affection. A couple of days after my last interview with Juliet, an event occurred which served certainly to relieve the tension and distract my thoughts, though not in a very agreeable manner. It was the pleasant, reposeful hour after dinner, when it was our custom to sit in our respective easy-chairs, and, as we smoked our pipes, discuss some of the many topics in which we had a common interest. The postman had just discharged into the capacious letter box an avalanche of letters and circulars, and as I sat glancing through the solitary letter that had fallen to my share, I looked from time to time at Thorndyke, and noticed, as I had often done before, with some surprise, a curious habit that he had of turning over and closely scrutinizing every letter and package before he opened it. "I observe, Thorndyke," I now ventured to remark, "that you always examine the outside of a letter before looking at the inside. I have seen other people do the same, and it has always appeared to me a singularly foolish proceeding. Why speculate over an unopened letter when a glance at the contents will tell you all there is to know?" "You are perfectly right," he answered, "if the object of the inspection is to discover who is the sender of the letter, but that is not my object. In my case the habit is one that has been deliberately cultivated, not in reference to letters only, but to everything that comes into my hands, the habit of allowing nothing to pass without a certain amount of conscious attention. The observant man is, in reality, the attentive man, and the so-called power of observation is simply the capacity for continuous attention. As a matter of fact, I have found in practice that the habit is a useful one, even in reference to letters. More than once I have gleaned a hint from the outside of a letter that has proved valuable when applied to the contents. Here, for instance, is a letter which has been opened after being fastened up, apparently by the aid of steam. The envelope is soiled and rubbed, and smells faintly of stale tobacco, and has evidently been carried in a pocket along with a well-used pipe. Why should it have been opened? On reading it I perceive that it should have reached me 2 days ago, and that the date has been skilfully altered from the 13th to the 15th. The inference is that my correspondent has a highly untrustworthy clerk." "But the correspondent may have carried the letter in his own pocket," I objected. "Hardly," replied Thorndyke. "He would not have troubled to steam his own letter open and close it again. He would have cut the envelope and addressed a fresh one. This the clerk could not do, because the letter was confidential and was addressed in the principal's handwriting, and the principal would have almost certainly added a postscript, and moreover he does not smoke. This, however, is all very obvious, but here is something rather more subtle, which I have put aside for a more detailed examination. What do you make of it?" He handed me a small parcel, to which was attached by a string a typewritten address label, the back of which bore the printed inscription, "James Bartlett and Sons, Cigar Manufacturers, London and Havana." "I'm afraid," said I, after turning the little packet over and examining every part of it minutely, "that this is rather too subtle for me. The only thing that I observe is that the typewriter has bungled the address considerably. Otherwise, this seems to me a very ordinary packet indeed." "Well, you have observed one point of interest at any rate," said Thorndyke, taking the packet from me. "But let us examine the thing systematically, and note down what we see. In the first place, you will notice that the label is an ordinary luggage label, such as you may buy at any stationer's, with its own string attached. Now, manufacturers commonly use a different and more substantial pattern, which is attached by the string of the parcel. But that is a small matter. What is much more striking is the address on the label. It is typewritten, and as you say, typed very badly. Do you know anything about typewriters?" "Very little." "Then you do not recognize the machine. Well, this label was typed with a Blickendorfer, an excellent machine, but not the form most commonly selected for the rough work of a manufacturer's office. But we will let that pass. The important point is this. The Blickendorfer Company makes several forms of machine, the smallest and lightest of which is the literary, specially designed for the use of journalists and men of letters. Now, this label was typed with the literary machine, or, at least, with the literary type wheel, which is really a very remarkable circumstance indeed." "How do you know that?" I asked. "By this asterisk, which has been written by mistake, the inexpert operator having pressed down the figure lever instead of the one for capitals. The literary type wheel is the only one that has an asterisk, as I noticed when I was thinking of purchasing a machine. Here, then, we have a very striking fact, for even if a manufacturer chose to use a Blick in his factory, it is inconceivable that he should select the literary form in preference to the more suitable commercial machine." "Yes, I agree. It is certainly very singular." "And now," pursued Thorndyke, "to consider the writing itself. It has been done by an absolute beginner. He has failed to space in 2 places. He has written 5 wrong letters, and he has written figures instead of capitals in 2 instances. Yes, he has made a shocking muddle of it. I wonder he didn't throw the label away and type another." "Precisely," said Thorndyke, "and if we wish to find out why he did not, we have only to look at the back of the label. You see that the name of the firm, instead of being printed on the label itself in the usual manner, is printed on a separate slip of paper, which is pasted on the label, a most foolish and clumsy arrangement, involving an immense waste of time. But if we look closely at the printed slip itself, we perceive something still more remarkable, for that slip has been cut down to fit the label, and has been cut with a pair of scissors. The edges are not quite straight, and in one place the overlap, which is so characteristic of the cut made with scissors, can be seen quite plainly." He handed the packet to me with a reading lens, through which I could distinctly make out the points he had mentioned. "Now I need not point out to you," he continued, "that these slips would ordinarily have been trimmed by the printer to the correct size in his machine, which would leave an absolutely true edge, nor need I say that no sane business man would adopt such a device as this. The slip of paper has been cut with scissors to fit the label, and it has then been pasted on the surface that it has been made to fit, when all this waste of time and trouble, which in practice means money, could have been saved by printing the name on the label itself." "Yes, that is so, but I still do not see why the fellow should not have thrown away this label and typed another." "Look at the slip again," said Thorndyke. "It is faintly but evenly discoloured, and, to me, has the appearance of having been soaked in water. Let us, for the moment, assume that it has been. That would look as if it had been removed from some other package, which again would suggest that the person using it had only the one slip, which he had soaked off the original package, dried, cut down, and pasted on the present label. If he pasted it on before typing the address, which he would most probably have done, he might well be unwilling to risk destroying it by soaking it a second time. You think, then, there is a suspicion that the package may have been tampered with?" "There is no need to jump to conclusions," replied Thorndyke. "I merely gave this case as an instance showing that careful examination of the outside of a package or letter may lead us to bestow a little extra attention on the contents. Now let us open it and see what those contents are." With a sharp knife he divided the outside cover, revealing a stout cardboard box wrapped in a number of advertisement sheets. The box, when the lid was raised, was seen to contain a single cigar, a large cheroot, packed in cotton wool. "A tricky, by Jove!" I exclaimed. "Your own special fancy, Thorndyke." "Yes, and another anomaly at once, you see, which might have escaped our notice if we had not been on the qui vive. "As a matter of fact, I don't see," said I. "You will think me an awful blockhead, but I don't perceive anything singular in a cigar manufacturer sending a sample cigar." "You read the label, I think," replied Thorndyke. "However, let us look at one of these leaflets and see what they say. Ah, here we are. Messrs. Bartlett and Sons, who own extensive plantations on the island of Cuba, manufacture their cigars exclusively from selected leaves grown by themselves. They would hardly make a Trichinopoly cheroot from leaf grown in the West Indies, so we have here a striking anomaly of an East Indian cigar sent to us by a West Indian grower." "And what do you infer from that?" "Principally that this cigar, which, by the way, is an uncommonly fine specimen, and which I would not smoke for £10,000, is deserving of very attentive examination." He produced from his pocket a powerful doublet lens, with the aid of which he examined every part of the surface of the cigar, and finally both ends. "Look at the small end," he said, handing me the cigar and the lens, "and tell me if you notice anything." I focused the lens on the flush-cut surface of closely rolled leaf, and explored every part of it minutely. "It seems to me," I said, "that the leaf is open slightly in the centre, as if a fine wire had been passed up it." "So it appears to me," replied Thorndyke, "and, as we are in agreement so far, we will carry our investigations a step further." He laid the cigar down on the table, and with the keen, thin-bladed penknife neatly divided it lengthwise into two halves. "Ecce signum!" exclaimed Thorndyke as the two parts fell asunder, and for a few moments we stood silently regarding the dismembered cheroot. For about half an inch from the small end there appeared a little circular patch of white, chalky material which, by the even manner in which it was diffused among the leaf, had evidently been deposited from a solution. "Our ingenious friend again, I surmise," said Thorndyke at length, taking up one of the halves and examining the white patch through his lens. "A thoughtful soul, Jervis, and original too. I wish his talents could be applied in some other direction. I shall have to remonstrate with him if he becomes troublesome." "It is your duty to society, Thorndyke," I exclaimed passionately, "to have this infernal cold-blooded scoundrel arrested instantly. Such a man is a standing menace to the community. Do you really know who sent this thing?" "I can form a pretty shrewd guess, which, however, is not quite the same thing. But you see, he has not been quite so clever this time, for he has left one or two traces by which his identity might be ascertained." "Indeed? What traces has he left?" "Ah, now, there is a nice little problem for us to consider." He settled himself in his easy chair and proceeded to fill his pipe with the air of a man who is about to discuss a matter of merely general interest. "Let us consider what information this ingenious person has given us about himself. In the first place, he evidently has a strong interest in my immediate decease. Now, why should he feel so urgent a desire for my death? Can it be a question of property? Hardly, for I am far from a rich man, and the provisions of my will are known to me alone. Can it then be a question of private enmity or revenge? I think not. To the best of my belief, I have no private enemies whatever. There remains only my vocation as an investigator in the fields of legal and criminal research. His interest in my death must, therefore, be connected with my professional activities. Now, I am at present conducting an exhumation which may lead to a charge of murder, but if I were to die tonight, the inquiry would be carried on with equal efficiency by Professor Spicer or some other toxicologist. My death would not affect the prospects of the accused, and so in one or two other cases that I have in hand, they could be equally well conducted by someone else. The inference is that our friend is not connected with any of these cases, but that he believes me to possess some exclusive information concerning him, believes me to be the one person in the world who suspects and can convict him. Let us assume that the existence of such a person of whose guilt I alone have evidence. Now this person, being unaware that I have communicated my knowledge to a third party, would reasonably suppose that by making away with me he had put himself in a position of security. Here, then, is our first point. The sender of this offering is probably a person concerning whom I hold certain exclusive information. But see, now the interesting corollary that follows from this. I alone suspect this person. Therefore, I have not published my suspicions, or others would suspect him too. Why, then, does he suspect me of suspecting him, since I have not spoken? Evidently, he too must be in possession of exclusive information. In other words, my suspicions are correct, for if they were not, he could not be aware of their existence. The next point is the selection of this rather unusual type of cigar. Why should he have sent a Trichinopoly instead of an ordinary Havana, such as Bartlett's actually manufacture? It looks as if he were aware of my peculiar predilection, and, thus consulting my personal tastes, has guarded against the chance of my giving the cigar to some other person. We may, therefore, infer that our friend probably has some knowledge of my habits. The third point is, what is the social standing of this gentle stranger, who we will call X? Now, Bartlett's do not send their advertisements and samples to Thomas, Richard, and Henry. They send, chiefly, to members of the professions and men of means and position. It is true that the original package might have been annexed by a clerk, office boy, or domestic servant, but the probabilities are that X received the package himself, and this is borne out by the fact that he was able to obtain access to a powerful alkaloid poison, such as this undoubtedly is. In that case, he would probably be a medical man or a chemist, I suggested. Not necessarily, replied Thorndyke. The laws relating to poisons are so badly framed and administered that any well-to-do person who has the necessary knowledge can obtain almost any poison that he wants. But social position is an important factor, whence we may conclude that X belongs, at least, to the middle class. The fourth point relates to the personal qualities of X. Now, it is evident from this instance alone that he is a man of exceptional intelligence, of considerable general information, and both ingenious and resourceful. This cigar device is not only clever and original, but it has been adapted to the special circumstances with remarkable forethought. Thus, the cheroot was selected, apparently, for two excellent reasons. First, that it was the most likely form to be smoked by the person intended, and second, that it did not require to have the end cut off, which might have led to the discovery of the poison. The plan also shows a certain knowledge of chemistry. The poison was not intended merely to be dissolved in the moisture of the mouth. The idea evidently was that the steam generated by the combustion of the leaf at the distal end would condense in the cooler part of the cigar and dissolve the poison, and the solution would then be drawn into the mouth. Then the nature of the poison and certain similarities of procedure seemed to identify X with the cyclist who used that ingenious bullet. The poison in this case is a white, non-crystalline solid. The poison contained in the bullet was a solution of white, non-crystalline solid, which analysis showed to be the most poisonous of all alkaloids. The bullet was virtually a hypodermic syringe. The poison in this cigar has been introduced in the form of an alcoholic or ethereal solution by a hypodermic syringe. We shall thus be justified in assuming that the bullet and the cigar came from the same person, and if this be so, we may say that X is a person of considerable knowledge, of great ingenuity, and no mean skill as a mechanician, as shown by the manufacture of the bullet. These are our principal facts, to which we may add the surmise that he has recently purchased a second-hand Blickensderfer of the literary form, or at least fitted with a literary type wheel. I don't quite see how you arrive at that, I said in some surprise. It's merely a guess, you know, he replied, though a probable one. In the first place, he is obviously unused to typing, as the numerous mistakes show. Therefore, he has not had that machine very long. The type is that which is peculiar to the Blickensderfer, and in one of the mistakes an asterisk has been printed in place of a letter, but the literary typewheel is the only one that has the asterisks. As to the age of the machine, there are evident signs of wear, for some of the letters have lost their sharpness, and this is most evident in the case of those letters which are the most used. The E, you will notice, for instance, is much worn, and E occurs more frequently than any other letter of the alphabet. Hence the machine, if recently purchased, was bought second hand. But, I objected, it may not have been his own machine at all. That is quite possible, answered Thorndyke, though considering the secrecy that would be necessary, the probabilities are in favour of his having bought it. But, in any case, we have here a means of identifying the machine, should we ever meet with it. He picked up the label and handed it to me, together with his pocket lens. Look closely at the E that we've been discussing. It occurs 5 times. In Thorndyke, in bench, in inner, and in temple. Now, in each case, you will notice a minute break in the loop, just at the summit. That break corresponds to a tiny dent in the type, caused probably by its striking some small, hard object. I can make it out quite distinctly, I said, and it should be a most valuable point for identification. It should be almost conclusive, Thorndyke replied, especially when joined to other facts that would be elicited by a search of his premises. And now let us just recapitulate the facts which our friend X has placed at our disposal. First, X is a person concerning whom I possess certain exclusive information. Second, he has some knowledge of my personal habits. Third, he is a man of some means and social position. Fourth, he is a man of considerable knowledge, ingenuity, and mechanical skill. Fifth, he has probably purchased, quite recently, a second-hand Blick, fitted with a literary typewheel. Sixth, that the machine, whether his own or some other person's property, can be identified by a characteristic mark on the small e. If you will note down those 6 points, and add that X is probably an expert cyclist and a fairly good shot with a rifle, you may possibly be able, presently, to complete the equation X equals ? I'm afraid, I said, I do not possess the necessary data, but I suspect you do, and if it is so, I repeat that it is your duty to society, to say nothing of your clients, whose interest would suffer by your death, to have this fellow laid by the heels before he does any mischief. Yes, I shall have to interfere if he becomes really troublesome, but I have reasons for wishing to leave him alone at present. You do really know who he is, then? Well, I think I can solve the equation that I have just offered to you for solution. You see, I have certain data, as you suggest, which you do not possess. There is, for instance, a certain ingenious gentleman concerning whom I hold what I believe to be exclusive information, and my knowledge of him does not make it appear unlikely that he might be the author of these neat little plans. I am much impressed, I said, as I put away my notebook, after having jotted down the points that Thorndyke had advised me to consider. I am much impressed by your powers of observation and your capacity for reasoning from apparently trivial data, but I do not see, even now, why you viewed that cigar with such immediate and decided suspicion. There was nothing actually to suggest the existence of poison in it, and yet you seemed to form the suspicion at once, and to search for it as though you expected to find it. Yes, replied Thorndyke, to a certain extent you are right. The idea of a poisoned cigar was not new to me, and thereby hangs a tale. He laughed softly and gazed into the fire with eyes that twinkled with quiet amusement. You have heard me say, he resumed after a short pause, that when I first took these chambers I had practically nothing to do. I had invented a new variety of medico-legal practice and had to build it up by slow degrees, and the natural consequence was that for a long time it yielded nothing but almost unlimited leisure. Now, that leisure was by no means wasted, for I employed it in considering the class of cases in which I was likely to be employed, and in working out theoretical examples, and seeing the crimes against the person having nearly always a strong medical interest, I gave them special attention. For instance, I planned a series of murders, selecting royal personages and great ministers as the victims, and on each murder I brought to bear all the special knowledge, skill, and ingenuity at my command. I inquired minutely into the habits of my hypothetical victims, ascertained who were their associates, friends, enemies, and servants, considered their diet, their residences, their modes of conveyance, the source of their clothing, and, in fact, everything which it was necessary to know in order to achieve their deaths with certainty and with absolute safety to the murderer. How deeply gratified and flattered those great personages would have felt, I remarked, if they had known how much attention they were receiving. Yes, I suppose it would have been somewhat startling, to the Prime Minister, for instance, to have learned that he was being watched and studied by an attentive observer, and that the arrangements for his decease had been completed down to the minutest detail. But, of course, the application of the method to a particular case was the essential thing, for it brought into view all the incidental difficulties, in meeting which all the really interesting and instructive details were involved. Well, the particulars of these crimes I wrote out at length in my private shorthand, in a journal which I kept for the purpose, and which, I need not say, I locked up securely in my safe when I was not using it. After completing each case, it was my custom to change sides and play the game over again from the opposite side of the board. That is to say, I added as an appendix to each case an analysis with a complete scheme for the detection of the crime. I have in my safe at the present moment 6 volumes of cases, fully indexed, and I can assure you that they are not only highly instructive reading, but are really valuable as works of reference. That I can readily believe, I replied, laughing heartily. Nevertheless, at the grotesqueness of the whole proceeding, though they might have proved rather incriminating documents if they had passed out of your possession, they would never have been read, rejoined Thorndyke. My shorthand is, I think, quite undecipherable, and has been so made intentionally with a view to secrecy. And have any of your theoretical cases ever turned up in real life? Several of them have, though very imperfectly planned and carried out as a rule. The poisoned cigar is one of them, though of course I should never have adopted such a conspicuous device for presenting it. And the incident of the other night is a modification, for the worst, of another. In fact, most of the intricate and artistic crimes with which I have had to deal professionally have had their more complete and elaborate prototypes in my journals. I was silent for some time, reflecting on the strange personality of my gifted friend, and the singular fitness that he presented for the part that he had chosen to play in the drama of social life. But presently my thoughts returned to the peril that overshadowed him, and I came back once more to my original question. "And now, Thorndyke," I said, "that you have penetrated both the motives and the disguise of this villain, what are you going to do? Is he to be put safely under lock and key, or is he to be left in peace and security to plan some other and perhaps more successful scheme for your destruction?" "For the present," replied Thorndyke, "I am going to put these things in a place of safety. Tomorrow you shall come with me to the hospital, and see me place the ends of the cigar in the custody of Dr. Chandler, who will make an analysis and report on the nature of the poison. After that we shall act in whatever way seems best." Unsatisfactory as this conclusion appeared, I knew it was useless to raise further objections, and accordingly, when the cigar with its accompanying papers and wrappings had been deposited in a drawer, we dismissed it, if not from our thoughts, at least from our conversation. End of chapter 13. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. Chapter 14 of The Red Thumb Mark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Kilmer. The Red Thumb Mark by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 14. A Startling Discovery. The morning of the trial, so long looked forward to, had at length arrived, and the train of events which it has been my business to chronicle in this narrative was now fast drawing to an end. To me those events had been in many ways of the deepest moment. Not only had they transported me from a life of monotonous drudgery into one charged with novelty and dramatic interest, not only had they introduced me to a renaissance of scientific culture and revived under new conditions my intimacy with the Conrad of my student days, but far more monotonous than any of these, they had given me the vision, all too fleeting, of happiness untold, with the reality of sorrow and bitter regret that promised to be all too enduring. Whence it happened that on this morning my thoughts were tinged with a certain greyness. A chapter in my life that had been both bitter and sweet was closing, and already I saw myself once more an Ishmaelite and a wanderer among strangers. This rather egotistical frame of mind, however, was soon dispelled when I encountered Polton, for the little man was in a veritable twitter of excitement at the prospect of witnessing the clearing up of the mysteries that had so severely tried his curiosity, and even Thorndyke, beneath his habitual calm, showed a trace of expectancy and pleasurable anticipation. "I have taken the liberty of making certain little arrangements on your behalf," he said, as we sat at breakfast, "of which I hope you will not disapprove. I have written to Mrs. Hornby, who is one of the witnesses, to say that you will meet her at Mr. Lawley's office, and escort her and Miss Gibson to the court. Walter Hornby may be with them, and, if he is, you had better leave him, if possible, to come on with Lawley." "You will not come to the office, then?" "No, I shall go straight to the court with Anstey. Besides, I am expecting Superintendent Miller from Scotland Yard, who will probably walk down with us." "I am glad to hear that," I said, "for I have been rather uneasy at the thought of you mixing in the crowd without some kind of protection." "Well, you see that I am taking precautions against the assaults of the too ingenious X, and to tell the truth, and also to commit a flagrant bull, I should never forgive myself if I allowed him to kill me before I had completed Reuben Hornby's defence. Ah, here is Polton. That man is on wires this morning. He has been wandering in and out of the rooms ever since he came, like a cat in a new house." "It's quite true, sir," said Polton, smiling and unabashed, "so it's no use denying it. I have come to ask what we are going to take with us to the court." "You will find a box and a portfolio on the table in my room," replied Thorndyke. "We had better also take a microscope and the micrometers, though we are not likely to want them. That is all, I think." "A box and a portfolio," repeated Polton in a speculative tone. "Yes, sir, I will take them with me." He opened the door and was about to pass out, when, perceiving a visitor ascending the stairs, he turned back. "Here's Mr. Miller from Scotland Yard, sir. Shall I show him in?" "Yes, do." He rose from his chair as a tall, military-looking man entered the room and saluted, casting at the same time an inquiring glance in my direction. "Good morning, Doctor," he said briskly. "I got your letter and couldn't make such of it, but I have brought down a couple of plain-clothes-men and a uniformed man, as you suggested. I understand you want a house watched." "Yes, and a man too. I will give you the particulars presently. That is, if you think you can agree to my conditions." "That I act entirely on my own account, and make no communication to anybody? Well, of course, I would rather you gave me all the facts and let me proceed in the regular way, but if you make conditions I have no choice but to accept them, seeing that you hold the cards." Perceiving that the matter in hand was of a confidential nature, I thought it best to take my departure, which I accordingly did as soon as I had ascertained that it wanted yet half an hour to the time at which Mrs. Hornby and Juliet were due at the lawyer's office. Mr. Lawley received me with stiffness that bordered on hostility. He was evidently deeply offended at the subordinate part that he had been compelled to play in the case, and was at no great pains to conceal the fact. "I am informed," he said in a frosty tone, when I had explained my mission, "that Mrs. Hornby and Miss Gibson are to meet you here. The arrangement is none of my making. None of the arrangements in this case are of my making. I have been treated throughout with a lack of ceremony and confidence that is positively scandalous. Even now I, the solicitor for the defence, am completely in the dark as to what defence is contemplated, though I fully expect to be involved in some ridiculous fiasco. I only trust that I may never again be associated with any of your hybrid practitioners. Ne sutor ultra crepidam, sir, is an excellent motto. Let the medical cobbler stick to his medical last." "It remains to be seen what kind of boot he can turn out on the legal last," I retorted. "That is so," he rejoined, "but I hear Mrs. Hornby's voice in the outer office, and as neither you nor I have any time to waste in idle talk, I suggest that you make your way to the court without delay. I wish you good morning." Acting on this very plain hint, I retired to the clerk's office, where I found Mrs. Hornby and Juliet, the former undisguisedly tearful and terrified, and the latter calm though pale and agitated. "We had better start at once," I said, when we had exchanged greetings. "Shall we take a cab or walk?" "I think we will walk, if you don't mind," said Juliet. "Mrs. Hornby wants to have a few words with you before we go into court. You see, she is one of the witnesses, and she is terrified lest she should say something damaging to Reuben." "By whom was the subpoena served?" I asked. "Mr. Lawley sent it," replied Mrs. Hornby, "and I went to see him about it the very next day, but he wouldn't tell me anything. He didn't seem to know what I was wanted for, and he wasn't at all nice, not at all." "I expect your evidence will relate to the 'Thumbograph,'" I said. "There is really nothing else in connection with the case that you have any knowledge of." "That is just what Walter said," exclaimed Mrs. Hornby. "I went to his rooms to talk the matter over with him. He is very upset about the whole affair, and I'm afraid he thinks very badly of poor Reuben's prospects. I only trust he may be wrong. Oh dear, what a dreadful thing it is, to be sure." Here the poor lady halted to mop her eyes elaborately, to the surprise and manifest scorn of a passing errand boy. "He was very thoughtful and sympathetic, Walter, I mean, you know," pursued Mrs. Hornby, "and most helpful. He asked me all I knew about the horrid little book, and took down my answers in writing. Then he wrote out the questions I was likely to be asked, with my answers, so that I could read them over and get them well into my head. Wasn't it good of him? And I made him print them with his machine so that I could read them without my glasses, and he did it beautifully. I have the paper in my pocket now." "I didn't know Mr. Walter went in for printing," I said. "Has he a regular printing press?" "It isn't a printing press exactly," replied Mrs. Hornby. "It is a small thing, with a lot of round keys that you press down. Dickensbelfer, I think it's called. Ridiculous name, isn't it? Walter bought it from one of his literary friends about a week ago, but he's getting quite clever with it already, though he does make a few mistakes still, as you can see." She halted again, and began to search for the opening of a pocket which was hidden away in some occult recess of her clothing, all unconscious of the effect that her explanation had produced on me. For instantly, as she spoke, there flashed into my mind one of the points that Thorndyke had given me for the identification of the mysterious X. He has probably purchased, quite recently, a second-hand Blickensderfer, fitted with a literary type-wheel. The coincidence was striking and even startling, though a moment's reflection convinced me that it was nothing more than a coincidence, for there must be hundreds of second-hand Blicks on the market, and as to Walter Hornby, he certainly could have no quarrel with Thorndyke, but would rather be interested in his preservation of Reuben's account. These thoughts passed through my mind so rapidly that by the time Mrs. Hornby had run her pocket to earth, I had quite recovered from the momentary shock. "Ah, here it is!" she exclaimed triumphantly, producing an obese morocco purse. "I put it in here for safety, knowing how liable one is to get one's pocket picked in these crowded London streets." She opened the bulky receptacle and drew it out after the manner of a concertina exhibiting multitudinous partitions, all stuffed with pieces of paper, coils of tape, and sewing silk, buttons, samples of dress materials, and miscellaneous rubbish, mingled indiscriminately with gold, silver, and copper coins. "Now, just run your eye through that, Dr. Jervis," she said, handing me a folded paper, "and give me your advice on my answers." I opened the paper and read, "The Committee of the Society for the Protection of Paralyzed Idiots, in submitting this—" "Oh, that isn't it. I have given you the wrong paper. How silly of me. That is the appeal of—you remember, Juliet, dear, that troublesome person I had really to be quite rude. You know, Dr. Jervis, I had to tell him that charity begins at home, although, thank heaven, none of us are paralyzed. But we must consider our own, mustn't we? And then—" "Do you think this is the one, dear?" interposed Juliet, in whose pale cheeks the ghost of a dimple had appeared. "It looks cleaner than most of the others." She selected a folded paper from the purse, which Mrs. Hornby was holding with both hands extended to its utmost, as though she were about to produce a burst of music, and, opening it, glanced at its contents. "Yes, this is your evidence," she said, and passed the paper to me. I took the document from her hand, and, in spite of the conclusion at which I had arrived, examined it with eager curiosity. At the very first glance I felt my head swim and my heart throb violently, for the paper was headed "Evidence respecting the Thumbograph," and in every one of the 5 small e's that occurred in that sentence I could see plainly, by the strong outdoor light, a small break or interval in the summit of the loop. I was thunderstruck. One coincidence was quite possible, and even probable, but the two together, and the second one so remarkable a character, were beyond all reasonable limits of probability. The identification did not seem to admit of a doubt, and yet— "Our legal adviser seems to be somewhat preoccupied," remarked Juliet, with something of her old gaiety of manner, and, in fact, though I held the paper in my hand, my gaze was fixed unmeaningly on an adjacent lamp post. As she spoke, I pulled myself together, and, scanning the paper hastily, was fortunate enough to find in the first paragraph matter requiring comment. "I observe, Mrs. Hornby," I said, "that in answer to the first question, 'Whence did you obtain the Thumbograph?' you say, 'I do not remember clearly. I think I must have bought it at a railway bookstore.' Now, I understood that it was brought home and given to you by Walter himself." "That was what I thought," replied Mrs. Hornby, "but Walter tells me that it was not so, and, of course, he would remember better than I should." "But, my dear aunt, I'm sure he gave it to you," interposed Juliet. "Don't you remember, it was the night the Coleys came to dinner, and we were so hard pressed to find amusement for them, when Walter came in and produced the Thumbograph?" "Yes, I remember quite well now," said Mrs. Hornby. "How fortunate that you reminded me. We must alter that answer at once. If I were you, Mrs. Hornby, I would disregard this paper altogether. It will only confuse you and get you into difficulties. Answer the questions that are put as well as you can, and if you don't remember, say so." "Yes, that will be the much wisest plan," said Juliet. "Let Dr. Jervis take charge of the paper, and rely on your own memory." "Very well, my dear," replied Mrs. Hornby. "I will do what you think best, and you can keep the paper, Dr. Jervis, or throw it away." I slipped the document into my pocket without remark, and we proceeded on our way, Mrs. Hornby babbling inconsequently, with occasional outbursts of emotion, and Juliet silent and abstracted. I struggled to concentrate my attention on the elder lady's conversation, but my thoughts continually reverted to the paper in my pocket, and the startling solution that it seemed to offer of the mystery of the poisoned cigar. Could it be that Walter Hornby was in reality the miscreant X? The thing seemed incredible, for hitherto no shadow of suspicion had appeared to fall on him, and yet there was no denying that his description tallied in a very remarkable manner with that of the hypothetical X. He was a man of some means and social position. He was a man of considerable knowledge and mechanical skill, though as to his ingenuity I could not judge. He had recently bought a second-hand Blickensderfer, which probably had a literary type-wheel, since it was purchased from a literary man, and that machine showed the characteristic mark on the small e. The two remaining points, indeed, were not so clear. Obviously, I could form no opinion as to whether or not Thorndyke held any exclusive information concerning him, and with reference to his knowledge of my friend's habits, I was at first inclined to be doubtful, until I suddenly recalled, with a pang of remorse and self-accusation, the various details I had communicated to Juliet, and that she might easily, in all innocence, have handed on to Walter. I had, for instance, told her of Thorndyke's preference for the Trichinopoly cheroot, and of this she might very naturally have spoken to Walter, who possessed a supply of them. Again, with regard to the time of our arrival at King's Cross, I had informed her of this in a letter which was in no way confidential, and again there was no reason why the information should not have been passed on to Walter, who was to have been one of the party at the family dinner. The coincidence seemed complete enough, in all truth, yet it was incredible that Reuben's cousin could be so black-hearted a villain, or could have any motive for these dastardly crimes. Suddenly a new idea struck me. Mrs. Hornby had obtained access to this typewriting machine, and if Mrs. Hornby could do so, why not John Hornby? The description would, for the most part, fit the elder man as well as the younger, though I had no evidence of his possessing any special mechanical skill. But my suspicions had already fastened upon him, and I remembered that Thorndyke had by no means rejected my theory which connected him with the crime. At this point my reflections were broken in upon by Mrs. Hornby, who grasped my arm and uttered a deep groan. We had reached the corner of the Old Bailey, and before us were the frowning walls of Newgate. Within those walls I knew, though I did not mention the fact, that Reuben Hornby was confined with the other prisoners who were awaiting their trial, and a glance at the massive masonry, stained to a dingy grey by the grime of the city, put an end to my speculation and brought me back to the drama that was so nearly approaching its climax. Down the old thoroughfare, crowded with so many memories of hideous tragedy, by the side of the gloomy prison, past the debtor's door with its forbidding spiked wicket, past the gallows gate with its festoons of fetters, we walked in silence until we reached the entrance to the Sessions House. Here I was not a little relieved to find Thorndyke on the lookout for us, for Mrs. Hornby, in spite of really heroic efforts to control her emotion, was in a state of impending hysteria, while Juliet, though outwardly calm and composed, showed by the waxen pallor of her cheeks and a certain wildness of her eyes that all her terror was reviving, and I was glad that they were spared the unpleasantness of contact with the policemen who guarded the various entrances. "We must be brave," said Thorndyke gently, as he took Mrs. Hornby's hand, "and show a cheerful face to our friend, who has so much to bear, and who bears it so patiently. A few more hours, and I hope we shall see restored not only his liberty but his honour. Here is Mr. Anstey, who, we trust, will be able to make his innocence apparent." Anstey, who, unlike Thorndyke, had already donned his wig and gown, bowed gravely, and together we passed through the mean and grimy portals into a dark hall. Policemen in uniform and unmistakable detectives stood about the various entries, and little knots of people, evil-looking and unclean for the most part, lurked in the background or sat on benches, and diffused through the stale musty air that distinctive but indescribable odour that clings to police vans and prison reception rooms, an odour that, in the present case, was pleasantly mingled with the suggestive aroma of disinfectants. Through the unsavoury throng we hurried, and up a staircase to a landing from which several passages diverged. Into one of these passages, a sort of dark entry, furnished with a cage-like gate of iron bars, we passed to a black door on which was painted the inscription, Old Court, Counsel and Clerks. Anstey held the door open for us, and we passed through into the court, which at once struck me with a sense of disappointment. It was smaller than I had expected, and plain and mean to the point of sordidness. The woodwork was poor, thinly disguised by yellow graining, and slimy with dirt wherever a dirty hand could reach it. The walls were distempered a pale greenish gray. The floor was of bare, dirty planking, and the only suggestion of dignity or display were those offered by the canopy over the judge's seat, lined with scarlet baize and surmounted by the royal arms. The scarlet cushions of the bench, and the large circular clock in the gallery, which was embellished with a gilded border, and asserted its importance by a loud, aggressive tick. Following Anstey and Thorndyke into the well of the court, we were ushered into one of the seats reserved for counsel, the third from the front, where we sat down and looked about us, while our two friends seated themselves in the front bench next to the central table. Here, at the extreme right, a barrister, presumably the counsel for the prosecution, was already in his place, and absorbed in the brief that lay on the desk before him. Straight before us were the seats for the jury, rising one above the other, and at their side the witness box. Above us on the right was the judge's seat, and immediately below it a structure somewhat resembling a large pew or a counting-house desk, surmounted by a brass rail, in which a person in a grey wig, the clerk of the court, was mending a quill pen. On our left rose the dock, suggestively large and roomy, enclosed at the side with high glazed frames, and above it, near the ceiling, was the spectators' gallery. "What a hideous place!" exclaimed Juliet, who separated me from Mrs. Hornby, "and how sordid and dirty everything looks." "Yes," I answered, "the uncleanliness of the criminal is not confined to his moral being. Wherever he goes he leaves a trail of actual physical dirt. It is not so long ago that the dock and the bench alike used to be strewn with medicinal herbs, and I believe the custom still survives of furnishing the judge with a nosegay as a preventive of jail fever. And to think that Reuben should be brought to a place like this," Juliet continued bitterly, "to be herded with such people as we saw downstairs." She sighed and looked around at the benches that rose behind us, where a half-dozen reporters were already seated and apparently in high spirits at the prospect of a sensational case. Our conversation was now interrupted by the clatter of feet on the gallery stairs, and heads began to appear over the wooden parapet. Several junior counsel filed into the seats in front of us. Mr. Lawley and his clerk entered the attorney's bench. The ushers took their stand below the jury box. A police officer seated himself at the desk in the dock, and inspectors, detectives, and miscellaneous officers began to gather in the entries or peer into the court through the small glazed openings in the doors. End of chapter 14. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas.
"15 of the Red Thumb Mark." This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. The Red Thumb Mark by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 15. The Fingerprint Experts. Part 1. The hum of conversation that had been gradually increasing as the court filled suddenly ceased. A door at the back of the dais was flung open. Counsel, solicitors, and spectators alike rose to their feet, and the judge entered closely followed by the Lord Mayor, the Sheriff, and various civic magnates, all picturesque and gorgeous in their robes and chains of office. The clerk of arraigns took his place behind his table under the dais. The counsel suspended their conversation and fingered their briefs, and, as the judge took his seat, lawyers, officials, and spectators took their seats, and all eyes were turned toward the dock. A few moments later Reuben Hornby appeared in the enclosure in company with a warder, the two rising, apparently, from the bowels of the earth, and stepping forward to the bar, stood with a calm, self-possessed demeanour, glancing somewhat curiously around the court. For an instant his eye rested upon the group of friends and well-wishers seated behind the counsel, and the faintest trace of a smile appeared on his face. But immediately he turned his eyes away, and never again throughout the trial looked in our direction. The clerk of arraigns now rose, and, reading from the indictment which lay before him on the table, addressed the prisoner. Reuben Hornby, you stand indicted for that you did, on the 9th or 10th day of March, feloniously steal a parcel of diamonds of the goods and chattels of John Hornby. Are you guilty or not guilty? Not guilty, replied Reuben. The clerk of arraigns, having noted the prisoner's reply, then proceeded. The gentlemen whose names are about to be called will form the jury who are to try you. If you wish to object to any of them, you must do so as each comes to the book to be sworn, and before he is sworn. You will then be heard. In acknowledgment of this address, which was delivered in clear, ringing tones, and with remarkable distinctness, Reuben bowed to the clerk, and the process of swearing in the jury was commenced, while the counsel opened their briefs, and the judge conversed facetiously with an official in a fur robe and a massive neck-chain. Very strange to unaccustomed eyes and ears was the effect of this function, half solemn and half grotesque, with an effect intermediate between that of a religious rite and that of a comic opera. Above the half-suppressed hum of conversation the clerk's voice arose at regular intervals, calling out the name of one of the jurymen, and, as its owner stood up, the court usher, black-gowned and sacerdotal of aspect, advanced and proffered the book. Then, as the juryman took the volume in his hand, the voice of the usher resounded through the court like that of a priest intoning some refrain or antiphon, an effect that was increased by the rhythmic and archaic character of the formula. Samuel Seppings. A stolid-looking working-man rose, and, taking the Testament in his hand, stood regarding the usher while that official sang out in a solemn monotone, You shall well and truly try and true deliverance make between our sovereign lord the king and the prisoner at the bar, whom you shall have in charge, and a true verdict give according to the evidence, so help you God. James Piper. Another juryman rose and was given the book to hold, and again the monotonous sing-song arose. You shall well and truly try and true deliverance make, etc. I shall scream aloud if that horrible chant goes on much longer, Juliet whispered. Why don't they all swear at once and have done with it? That would not meet the requirements, I answered. However, there are only 2 more, so you must have patience. And you will have patience with me too, won't you? I am horribly frightened. It is all so solemn and dreadful. You must try to keep up your courage until Dr. Thorndyke has given his evidence, I said. Remember that, until he has spoken, everything is against Reuben, so be prepared. I will try, she answered meekly, but I can't help being terrified. The last of the jurymen was at length sworn, and when the clerk had once more called out the names one by one, the usher counting loudly as each man answered to his name, the latter officer turned to the court and spectators, and proclaimed in solemn tones, If anyone can inform my lords the King's Justices, the King's Attorney General, or the King's Sergeant, ere this inquest be now taken between our sovereign lord the King and the prisoner at the bar, of any treason, murder, felony, or misdemeanour, committed or done by him, let him come forth and he shall be heard, for the prisoner stands at the bar upon his deliverance. This proclamation was followed by a profound silence, and after a brief interval the clerk of arraigns turned toward the jury and addressed them collectively. Gentlemen of the jury, the prisoner at the bar stands indicted by the name of Reuben Hornby, for that he, on the 9th or 10th of March, feloniously did steal, take, and carry away a parcel of diamonds of the goods of John Hornby. To this indictment he has pleaded that he is not guilty, and your charge is to inquire whether he be guilty or not, and to hearken to the evidence. When he had finished his address, the clerk sat down, and the judge, a thin-faced, hollow-eyed, elderly man, with bushy grey eyebrows and a very large nose, looked attentively at Reuben for some moments over the tops of his gold-rimmed pince-nez. Then he turned toward the counsel nearest the bench and bowed slightly. The barrister bowed in return and rose, and for the first time I obtained a complete view of Sir Hector Trumpler, K.C., the counsel for the prosecution. His appearance was not prepossessing, nor, though he was a large man and somewhat florid as to his countenance, particularly striking, except for the general air of untidiness. His gown was slipping off one shoulder, his wig was perceptibly awry, and his pince nez threatened every moment to drop from his nose. "The case that I have to present to you, my lord and gentlemen of the jury," he began in a clear though unmusical voice, "is one the like of which is but too often met with in this court. It is one in which we shall see unbounded trust met by treacherous deceit, in which we shall see countless benefactions rewarded by the basest ingratitude, and in which we shall witness the deliberate renunciation of a life of honourable effort in favour of the tortuous and precarious ways of the criminal. The facts of the case are briefly as follows. The prosecutor in this case, most unwilling prosecutor, gentlemen, is Mr. John Hornby, who is a metallurgist and dealer in precious metals. Mr. Hornby has two nephews, the orphan sons of his two elder brothers, and I may tell you that since the decease of their parents he has acted the part of a father to both of them. One of these nephews is Mr. Walter Hornby, and the other is Reuben Hornby, the prisoner at the bar. Both of these nephews were received by Mr. Hornby into his business with a view to their succeeding him when he should retire, and both, I need not say, occupied positions of trust and responsibility. Now, on the evening of the 9th of March there was delivered to Mr. Hornby a parcel of rough diamonds, of which one of his clients asked him to take charge pending their transfer to the brokers. I need not burden you with irrelevant details concerning this transaction. It will suffice to say that the diamonds, which were of the aggregate value of about £30,000, were delivered to him, and the unopened package deposited by him in his safe, together with a slip of paper on which he had written in pencil a memorandum of the circumstances. This was on the evening of the 9th of March, as I have said. Having deposited the parcel, Mr. Hornby locked the safe, and shortly afterwards left the premises and went home, taking the keys with him. On the following morning, when he unlocked the safe, he perceived with astonishment and dismay that the parcel of diamonds had vanished. The slip of paper, however, lay at the bottom of the safe, and on picking it up Mr. Hornby perceived that it bore a smear of blood, and in addition the distinct impression of a human thumb. On this he closed and locked the safe, and sent a note to the police station, in response to which a very intelligent officer, Inspector Sanderson, came and made a preliminary examination. I need not follow the case further, since the details will appear in the evidence, but I may tell you that, in effect, it has been made clear beyond all doubt that the thumb print on that paper was the thumb print of the prisoner, Reuben Hornby. He paused to adjust his glasses, which were in the very act of falling from his nose, and hitch up his gown, while he took a leisurely survey of the jury, as though he were estimating their impressionability. At this moment I observed Walter Hornby enter the court and take up a position at the end of our bench nearest the door, and immediately after, Superintendent Miller came in and seated himself on one of the benches opposite. "The first witness whom I shall call," said Sir Hector Trumpler, "is John Hornby." Mr. Hornby, looking wild and agitated, stepped into the witness box, and the usher, having handed him the testament, sang out, "The evidence you shall give to the court and jury sworn, between our sovereign lord the king and the prisoner at the bar, shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God." Mr. Hornby kissed the book, and, casting a glance of unutterable misery at his nephew, turned towards the counsel. "Your name is John Hornby, is it not?" asked Sir Hector. "It is." "And you occupy the premises in St. Mary Axe?" "Yes. I am a dealer in precious metals, but my business consists principally in the assaying of samples of ore and quartz, and bars of silver and gold." "Do you remember what happened on the 9th of March last?" "Perfectly. My nephew Reuben, the prisoner, delivered to me a parcel of diamonds which he had received from the purser of the Elmina Castle, to whom I had sent him as my confidential agent. I had intended to deposit the diamonds with my banker, but when the prisoner arrived at my office the banks were already closed, so I had to put the parcel, for the night, in my own safe. I may say that the prisoner was not in any way responsible for the delay." "You are not here to defend the prisoner," said Sir Hector. "Answer my questions and make no comments, if you please. Was anyone present when you placed the diamonds in the safe?" "No one was present but myself." "I did not ask if you were present when you put them in," said Sir Hector, whereupon the spectators sniggered and the judge smiled indulgently. "What else did you do?" "I wrote in pencil on a leaf of my pocket memorandum book, handed in by Reuben at 7:3 p.m. 9/3/01, and initialed it. Then I tore the leaf from the block and laid it on the parcel, after which I closed the safe and locked it." "How soon did you leave the premises after this?" "Almost immediately. The prisoner was waiting for me in the outer office." "Never mind where the prisoner was. Confine your answers to what is asked. Did you take the keys with you?" "Yes." "When did you next open the safe?" "On the following morning at 10 o'clock." "Was the safe locked or unlocked when you arrived?" "It was locked. I unlocked it." "Did you notice anything unusual about the safe?" "No." "Had the keys left your custody in the interval?" "No. They were attached to a key chain which I always wear." "Are there any duplicates of those keys? The keys of the safe, I mean." "No, there are no duplicates." "Have the keys ever gone out of your possession?" "Yes. If I had to be absent from the office for a considerable time, it has been my custom to hand the keys to one of my nephews, whichever has happened to be in charge at the time." "And never to any other person?" "Never to any other person." "What did you observe when you opened the safe?" "I observed that the parcel of diamonds had disappeared." "Did you notice anything else?" "Yes. I found the leaf from my memorandum block lying at the bottom of the safe. I picked it up and turned it over, and then saw that there were smears of blood on it and what looked like the print of a thumb in blood. The thumb mark was on the under surface, as the paper lay at the bottom of the safe." "What did you do next?" "I closed and locked the safe, and sent a note to the police station, saying that a robbery had been committed on my premises." "You have known the prisoner several years, I believe?" "Yes, I have known him all his life. He is my eldest brother's son." "Then you can tell us, no doubt, whether he is left-handed or right-handed?" "I should say he was ambidextrous, but he uses his left hand by preference." "A fine distinction, Mr. Hornby, a very fine distinction. Now tell me, did you ascertain beyond all doubt that the diamonds were really gone?" "Yes. I examined the safe thoroughly, first by myself and afterwards with the police. There was no doubt that the diamonds had really gone." "When the detective suggested that you should have the thumb prints of your two nephews taken, did you refuse?" "I refused." "Why did you refuse?" "Because I did not choose to subject my nephews to the indignity. Besides, I had no power to make them submit to the proceeding." "Had you any suspicions of either of them?" "I had no suspicions of any one." "Kindly examine this piece of paper, Mr. Hornby," said Sir Hector, passing across a small oblong slip, "and tell us if you recognize it." Mr. Hornby glanced at the paper for a moment and then said, "This is the memorandum slip that I found lying at the bottom of the safe." "How do you identify it?" "By the writing on it, which is in my own hand and bears my initials." "Is it the memorandum that you placed on the parcel of diamonds?" "Yes." "Was there any thumb mark or blood smear on it when you placed it in the safe?" "No." "Was it possible that there could have been any such marks?" "Quite impossible. I tore it from my memorandum block at the time I wrote upon it." "Very well." Sir Hector Trumpler sat down, and Mr. Anstey stood up to cross-examine the witness. "You have told us, Dr. Hornby," he said, "that you have known the prisoner all his life. Now what estimate have you formed of his character?" "I have always regarded him as a young man of the highest character. Honourable, truthful, and in every way trustworthy. I have never, in all my experience of him, known him to deviate a hair's breadth from the strictest honour and honesty of conduct." "You regarded him as a man of irreproachable character, is that so?" "That is so, and my opinion of him is unchanged." "Has he, to your knowledge, any expensive or extravagant habits?" "No. His habits are simple and rather thrifty." "Have you ever known him to bet, gamble, or speculate?" "Never." "Has he ever seemed to be in want of money?" "No. He has a small private income, apart from his salary, which I know he does not spend, since I have occasionally employed my broker to invest his savings." "Apart from the thumb print which was found in the safe, are you aware of any circumstances that would lead you to suspect the prisoner of having stolen the diamonds?" "None whatever." Mr. Anstey sat down, and Mr. Hornby left the witness box, mopping the perspiration from his forehead. The next witness was called. "Inspector Sanderson." The dapper police officer stepped briskly into the box, and, having been duly sworn, faced the prosecuting counsel with the air of a man who was prepared for any contingency. "Do you remember," said Sir Hector, after the usual preliminaries had been gone through, "what occurred on the morning of the 10th of March?" "Yes. A note was handed to me at the station at 10:23 a.m. It was from Mr. John Hornby, and stated that a robbery had occurred at his premises in St. Mary Axe. I went to the premises and arrived there at 10:31 a.m. There I saw the prosecutor, Mr. John Hornby, who told me that a parcel of diamonds had been stolen from the safe. At his request I examined the safe. There were no signs of its having been forced open. The lock seemed to be quite uninjured and in good order. Inside the safe, on the bottom, I found 2 good-sized drops of blood and a slip of paper with pencil writing on it. The paper bore 2 blood smears and a print of a human thumb in blood. "Is this the paper?" asked the counsel, passing a small slip across to the witness. "Yes," replied the inspector, after a brief glance at the document. "What did you do next?" "I sent a message to Scotland Yard acquainting the chief of the Criminal Investigation Department with the facts, and then went back to the station. I had no further connection with the case." Sir Hector sat down, and the judge glanced at Anstey. "You tell us," said the latter, rising, "that you observed 2 good-sized drops of blood on the bottom of the safe. Did you notice the condition of the blood, whether moist or dry?" "The blood looked moist, but I did not touch it. I left it undisturbed for the detective officers to examine." The next witness called was Sergeant Bates, of the Criminal Investigation Department. He slipped into the box with the same ready, businesslike air as the other officer, and, having been sworn, proceeded to give his evidence with a fluency that suggested careful preparation, holding an open notebook in his hand, but making no references to it. "On the 10th of March, at 12:08 p.m., I received instructions to proceed to St. Mary Axe to inquire into a robbery that had taken place there. Inspector Sanderson's report was handed to me, and I read it in the cab on my way to the premises. On arriving at the premises at 12:30 p.m., I examined the safe carefully. It was quite uninjured, and there were no marks of any kind upon it. I tested the locks and found them perfect. There were no marks or indications of any picklock having been used. On the bottom of the inside I observed 2 rather large drops of a dark fluid. I took up some of the fluid on a piece of paper and found it to be blood. I also found in the bottom of the safe the burnt head of a wax match, and, on searching the floor of the office, I found close by the safe a used wax match from which the head had fallen. I also found a slip of paper which appeared to have been torn from a perforated block. On it was written in pencil, 'Handed in by Reuben at 7:03 p.m. 9301 J.H.' There were 2 smears of blood on the paper and the impression of a human thumb in blood. I took possession of the paper in order that it might be examined by the experts. I inspected the office doors and the outer door of the premises, but found no signs of forcible entrance on any of them. I questioned the housekeeper, but obtained no information from him. I then returned to headquarters, made my report, and handed the paper with the marks on it to the superintendent." "Is this the paper that you found in the safe?" asked the counsel, once more handing the leaflet across. "Yes, this is the paper." "What happened next?" "The following afternoon I was sent for by Mr. Singleton, of the Finger print Department. He informed me that he had gone through the files and had not been able to find any thumb print resembling the one on the paper, and recommended me to endeavour to obtain prints of the thumbs of any person who might have been concerned in the robbery. He also gave me an enlarged photograph of the thumb print for reference if necessary. I accordingly went to St. Mary Axe and had an interview with Mr. Hornby. When I requested him to allow me to take the prints of the thumbs of all the persons employed on the premises, including his 2 nephews. This he refused, saying that he distrusted finger prints and that there was no suspicion of anyone on the premises. I asked if he would allow his nephews to furnish their thumb prints privately, to which he replied, certainly not. "Had you then any suspicion of either of the nephews?" I thought they were both open to some suspicion. The safe had certainly been opened with false keys, and as they both had the real keys in their possession it was possible that one of them might have taken impressions in wax and made counterfeit keys." "Yes?" "I called on Mr. Hornby several times and urged him for the sake of his nephew's reputations to sanction the taking of the thumb prints, but he refused very positively and forbade them to submit, although I understood that they were both willing. It then occurred to me to try if I could get any help from Mrs. Hornby, and on the 15th of March I called at Mr. Hornby's private house and saw her. I explained to her what was wanted to clear her nephews from the suspicion that rested on them, and she then said that she could dispose of these suspicions at once, for she could show me the thumb prints of the whole family. She had them all in a 'thumbograph.'" "A 'thumbograph'?" repeated the judge. "What is a 'thumbograph'?" Anstey rose, with a little red-covered volume in his hand. "A 'thumbograph', my lord," said he, "is a book, like this, in which foolish people collect the thumb prints of their more foolish acquaintances." He passed the volume up to the judge, who turned over the leaves curiously and then nodded to the witness. "Yes, she said she had them all in a 'thumbograph.' Then she fetched from a drawer a small red-covered book which she showed to me. It contained the thumb prints of all the family and some of her friends." "Is this the book?" asked the judge, passing the volume down to the witness. The sergeant turned over the leaves until he came to one which he apparently recognized, and said, "Yes, my lord, this is the book. Mrs. Hornby showed me the thumb prints of various members of the family, and then found those of her two nephews. I compared them with the photograph that I had with me, and discovered that the print of the left thumb of Reuben Hornby was in every respect identical with the thumb print shown in the photograph." "What did you do then?" "I asked Mrs. Hornby to lend me the 'thumbograph' so that I might show it to the chief of the Finger print Department, to which she consented. I had not intended to tell her my discovery, but, as I was leaving, Mr. Hornby arrived home, and when he heard of what had taken place, he asked me why I wanted the book, and I then told him. He was greatly astonished and horrified, and wished me to return the book at once. He proposed to let the whole matter drop and take the loss of the diamonds on himself, but I pointed out that this was impossible, as it would practically amount to compounding a felony. Seeing that Mrs. Hornby was so distressed at the idea of her book being used in evidence against her nephew, I promised her that I would return it to her if I could obtain a thumb print in any other way. I then took the 'thumbograph' to Scotland Yard and showed it to Mr. Singleton, who agreed that the print of the left thumb of Reuben Hornby was in every respect identical with the thumb print on the paper found in the safe. On this I applied for a warrant for the arrest of Reuben Hornby, which I executed on the following morning. I told the prisoner what I had promised Mrs. Hornby, and he then offered to allow me to take a print of his left thumb, so that his aunt's book should not have to be used in evidence." "How is it, then," asked the judge, "that it has been put in evidence?" "It has been put in by the defence, my lord," said Sir Hector Trumpler. "I see," said the judge. "A hair of the dog that bit him. The 'thumbograph' is to be applied as a remedy on the principle that similia similibus curantur. Well?" "When I arrested him, I administered the usual caution, and the prisoner then said, 'I am innocent. I know nothing about the robbery.'" The counsel for the prosecution sat down, and Anstey rose to cross-examine. "You have told us," said he, in his clear musical voice, "that you found at the bottom of the safe two rather large drops of a dark fluid which you considered to be blood. Now, what led you to believe that fluid to be blood?" "I took some of the fluid up on a piece of white paper, and it had the appearance and colour of blood." "Was it examined microscopically or otherwise?" "Not to my knowledge." "Was it quite liquid?" "Yes, I should say quite liquid." "What appearance had it on paper?" "It looked like a clear red liquid of the colour of blood and was rather thick and sticky." Anstey sat down, and the next witness, an elderly man, answering to the name of Francis Simmons, was called. "You are the housekeeper at Mr. Hornby's premises in St. Mary Axe?" asked Sir Hector Trumpler. "I am." "Did you notice anything unusual on the night of the 9th of March?" "I did not." "Did you make your usual rounds on that occasion?" "Yes, I went all over the premises several times during the night, and the rest of the time I was in a room over the private office." "Who arrived first on the morning of the 10th?" "Mr. Reuben. He arrived about 20 minutes before anybody else." What part of the building did he go to?" "He went to the private office, which I opened for him. He remained there a few minutes before Mr. Hornby arrived, when he went up to the laboratory." "Who came next?" "Mr. Hornby and Mr. Walter came in just after him." The counsel sat down, and Anstey proceeded to cross examine the witness. "Who was the last to leave the premises on the evening of the 9th?" "I am not sure." "Why are you not sure?" "I had to take a note and a parcel to a firm at Shoreditch. When I started, a clerk named Thomas Holker was in the outer office, and Mr. Walter Hornby was in the private office. When I returned they had both gone." "Was the outer door locked?" "Yes." "Had Holker a key of the outer door?" "No. Mr. Hornby and his two nephews each had a key, and I had one. No one else had a key." "How long were you absent?" "About 3/4 of an hour." "Who gave you the note and the parcel?" "Mr. Walter Hornby." "When did he give them to you?" "He gave them to me just before I started, and told me to go at once for fear the place should be closed before I got there." "And was the place closed?" "Yes. It was all shut up, and everybody had gone." Anstey resumed his seat. The witness shuffled out of the box with an air of evident relief, and the usher called out, "Henry James Singleton." CHAPTER 16.